Kahneman explores one of the most pervasive cognitive errors, our belief that we understand the past and can therefore predict the future. This illusion of understanding stems from our mind's instinct to transform random, complex events into simple, coherent narratives. System 1 seeks meaning, not truth. It builds stories that make sense after the fact, concealing how unpredictable reality actually is. He begins with the observation that successful stories about history, business, or politics always appear obvious in hindsight. When we look back, we see causal chains, decisions, personalities, turning points that seem to explain everything. Yet before these events occurred, their outcomes were far from certain. Kahneman calls this the hindsight bias, the tendency to believe that past events were predictable once we know the result. In hindsight, System 1 rewrites memory to fit the new information, erasing uncertainty. We forget what we once didn't know and underestimate the role of chance. The collapse of a company, the outcome of an election, or a successful military campaign all appear inevitable afterward. The human mind cannot easily reconstruct the confusion and ambiguity that existed before the result was known. Kahneman shows that this bias distorts both learning and accountability. When success occurs, we credit leadership, strategy, or vision. When failure strikes, we blame poor judgment or incompetence. Yet in most cases, outcomes depend heavily on luck and external factors beyond anyone's control. The illusion of understanding makes us overconfident in narratives and underestimates randomness. He revisits examples from business journalism, which thrives on coherent post hoc explanations. When a company prospers, analysts describe visionary leadership, disciplined culture, and bold strategy. When it falters, the same traits are reinterpreted as arrogance, rigidity, or recklessness. The facts don't change, only the story does. The same consistency of narrative that comforts readers blinds them to the truth. Success and failure are often indistinguishable processes judged by outcomes, not by quality of decisions. Kahneman calls this phenomenon the halo of success. Once we know a person or organization has succeeded, we retroactively assign them intelligence, courage, and foresight. When they fail, the same traits are seen as flaws. This retrospective coherence gives us a false sense of comprehension and makes us believe the world is more predictable than it is. He links this illusion to our inability to learn from history. Because past events are always reinterpreted through causal stories, we fail to grasp the uncertainty and randomness that define them. As a result, we underestimate future surprises. Every generation believes it lives in uniquely turbulent times, but still assumes that current trends will continue smoothly forward, another manifestation of hindsight bias. Kahneman also highlights the emotional comfort provided by coherence. Randomness feels chaotic and intolerable. Causal stories provide psychological relief. System 1 imposes order even when none exists, constructing narratives of heroism, villainy, and inevitability. This gives rise to myths of foresight, believing that leaders saw it coming or that outcomes had to happen. To illustrate the power of hindsight, Kahneman recalls how military or intelligence failures are judged. After a surprise attack or strategic blunder, analysts and politicians claim the warning signs were obvious and that authorities should have known. In reality, such signs are always buried among countless false alarms. The illusion of understanding arises because System 1 reconstructs the past selectively, discarding noise and emphasizing whatever fits the final outcome. He concludes that the illusion of understanding is not a flaw in memory, but a feature of how the mind builds coherence. We are narrative creatures designed to impose meaning on uncertainty. Yet this strength becomes a weakness in complex systems, markets, wars, politics, where randomness dominates. The practical lesson is humility. Resist the temptation to believe that clarity after the fact equals foresight before it. The world is not a tidy story, but a collection of countless possibilities, most of which never happen. Wisdom begins with acknowledging how little we truly understand about what has already occurred, and how even less we can predict about what will. Kahneman examines the powerful conviction people have in the accuracy of their own judgments, even when those judgments are demonstrably unreliable. This phenomenon, the illusion of validity, arises because confidence and correctness are not correlated in human reasoning. System 1 confuses the internal coherence of a story with its external truth. As long as a judgment feels consistent and plausible, it feels right. He begins by revisiting his experience, assessing candidates for officer training. Despite clear evidence that the evaluations were poor predictors of later performance, Kahneman and his colleagues continued to feel confident in their judgments. Their impressions, formed by vivid observations of behavior, created a strong sense of understanding and predictive power. The mind's emotional certainty overpowered statistical reality. System 1 operates by pattern recognition. When an impression fits a familiar pattern, it produces immediate confidence. The more coherent and vivid the evidence, the stronger the belief. However, coherence does not equal validity. Kahneman explains that our brains are built to favor consistent stories over accurate ones. We believe what feels true. He describes how this illusion affects experts across fields. Financial analysts, for instance, believe they can forecast market trends based on charts or gut feelings, though their predictions perform no better than chance. Psychologists, doctors, and intelligence officers trust their intuition even when statistical models outperform them. Once an expert sees a pattern that makes sense, System 1 floods the mind with a feeling of certainty that System 2 rarely challenges. Kahneman highlights that the illusion of validity is self-reinforcing. When outcomes occasionally confirm our expectations, we treat them as proof of skill and ignore the many times we were wrong. Memory selectively recalls successes, while failures fade or are explained away. Over time, confidence grows stronger, even as accuracy remains unchanged. The illusion thrives especially when two conditions are met. The evidence seems coherent and internally consistent, and feedback is slow, ambiguous, or missing. These conditions describe most real-world domains: business, politics, intelligence, and investment, where feedback is delayed or distorted. In such environments, intuition feels trustworthy because nothing contradicts it immediately. The absence of disconfirmation becomes mistaken for validation. Kahneman contrasts intuitive confidence with statistical reasoning. Statistical thinking recognizes uncertainty, variability, and error margins. Intuition recognizes none of these. It produces narrative certainty, a psychological comfort that masquerades as knowledge. He emphasizes that this bias is not limited to amateurs. The more experienced people become, the more convincing their illusions often grow, because familiarity increases coherence and fluency, not accuracy. He also discusses the representativeness heuristic, which fuels the illusion of validity. When someone's behavior or situation fits a familiar stereotype, we jump to conclusions with high confidence. For example, if an investment manager looks and sounds decisive and analytical, investors assume competence without examining long-term performance. The fit between image and expectation feels like evidence. Kahneman presents statistical evidence showing that mechanical models consistently outperform human judgment in predictive accuracy. In numerous studies covering medical diagnosis, academic success, job performance, and parole decisions, simple formulas based on measurable variables beat expert intuition. Yet people resist using algorithms because they lack the emotional conviction that intuition provides. We prefer being confidently wrong to feeling uncertain, even when uncertainty yields better results. He connects the illusion of validity to overconfidence in prediction. People exaggerate the accuracy of their forecasts, especially when the evidence forms a coherent story. Once a mental model is in place, contradictory facts are ignored or rationalized. The smoother the narrative, the greater the confidence, regardless of truth. Kahneman concludes that the antidote to this illusion is discipline and awareness. Confidence should not be treated as a sign of accuracy. The rational thinker must separate how compelling a story feels from how true it actually is. Real understanding requires humility, a willingness to accept that intuition, even when it feels infallible, is often blind to its own limits. The final insight of the chapter: we are confident not because we are right, but because the story we tell ourselves is coherent. Recognizing that distinction is the foundation of sound judgment and the first step toward taming the deceptive power of intuition, Kahneman turns to one of the most practical and unsettling findings of behavioral research. Simple statistical formulas consistently outperform human intuition in predicting outcomes. Across medicine, education, psychology, and business, data-driven rules beat experts who rely on experience, even when those experts are intelligent and conscientious. Yet people resist this conclusion because it undermines their faith in judgment and individuality. He begins with the pioneering work of Paul Meehl, a psychologist who compared the accuracy of clinical predictions made by professionals, doctors, counselors, judges, with those made by simple algorithms. Meehl's studies revealed that mechanical models, based on a few measurable factors, outperformed expert intuition in almost every case. Even when experts had access to more information, their predictions were less consistent and less accurate. Kahneman explains why. Humans are noisy and biased. Their judgments fluctuate from day to day, depend on mood and context, and are influenced by irrelevant details. Formulas, by contrast, apply the same rule every time. System 1 seeks patterns, coherence, and meaning. Formulas merely count. The latter may seem dull, but consistency gives them power. He illustrates this with examples. A simple rule based on high school grades and test scores predicts college success better than admissions officers' holistic impressions. In medicine, linear models often outperform experienced clinicians when diagnosing diseases or estimating survival rates. In finance, algorithms that weight key indicators outperform analysts who try to read the market. Wherever intuition competes with data, data wins, quietly and repeatedly. Yet, Kahneman notes, experts resist formulas for emotional and psychological reasons. They feel that human insight captures nuance while rules feel mechanical and dehumanizing. This resistance is amplified by the illusion of validity. Because intuitive judgments feel coherent, experts believe they are correct. The consistent superiority of formulas is perceived as a threat to autonomy and expertise. He describes how the success of formulas depends on two factors: predictability of the environment and opportunity for feedback. In stable, rule-governed settings like diagnosing diseases or evaluating credit risk, patterns repeat and statistical models excel. In environments where experts receive quick, clear feedback, like firefighting or chess, intuition can become skilled and reliable. But in uncertain, high-noise domains like investing or intelligence analysis, intuition is largely unreliable. Kahneman connects this to his earlier distinction between System 1, fast, intuitive, and System 2, slow, analytical. Formulas embody System 2's strengths: consistency, transparency, and statistical discipline. Experts rely on System 1, which is prone to bias, overconfidence, and narrative illusion. Yet System 1 produces a powerful emotional reward, confidence, while formulas do not. He gives a striking example: a study predicting the success of newly hired employees. Managers' interviews were less predictive than a formula based on 6 objective personality measures. When managers used the formula first and then added their intuition, accuracy decreased. The formula improved predictions, intuition degraded them. Kahneman concludes that the best use of intuition is in the design of rules, not in making final judgments. Experts can identify which variables matter, but the actual decision-making should follow statistical logic. Once a formula is established, sticking to it yields more reliable results than trusting one's gut. He acknowledges, however, that full reliance on formulas is psychologically difficult. People need to feel agency and meaning in their work. The compromise is to adopt structured judgment, rules informed by data but allowing limited intuition within defined boundaries. The chapter closes with a disquieting truth. Human judgment is not merely fallible, it is predictably fallible. Formulas are humbler but more reliable because they do not pretend to understand causes. They only track patterns. Kahneman's lesson is clear. When intuition and statistics disagree, bet on the numbers. Kahneman now asks a central question: if intuition is so often unreliable, when can it be trusted? Not all intuitive judgments are flawed. Some are extraordinarily accurate. The key is understanding the conditions that make intuition valid rather than illusory. Drawing on the research of psychologist Gary Klein, Kahneman concludes that expert intuition can be trusted only in specific, structured environments where feedback is clear, rapid, and repeated. He contrasts true expertise with illusory confidence. In fields like firefighting, chess, and surgery, professionals develop reliable intuition through thousands of hours of practice. The environment is regular and feedback immediate. Success and failure are clearly linked to action. System 1 learns genuine patterns through experience, producing what appears to be instinctive insight. A seasoned firefighter can sense an impending building collapse, or a chess master can spot a brilliant move in seconds. These are authentic forms of intuition, grounded in reality. By contrast, in fields like stock trading, political forecasting, or intelligence analysis, the environment is noisy, outcomes are delayed, and feedback is ambiguous. Here, intuitive judgments are mostly unreliable, no matter how confident they feel. Patterns seem to exist but are largely random. The mind, seeking coherence, imagines causality where there is none. As Kahneman puts it, in an unpredictable environment, intuition is nothing more than overconfidence in disguise. He identifies two conditions that must be met for intuition to be trustworthy: an environment with sufficient regularity to be predictable, and opportunities for prolonged practice and accurate feedback. When these are absent, intuition is misleading. The problem is that System 1 cannot tell the difference. It feels equally confident in both situations. Kahneman and Klein famously debated whether expert intuition could be trained. Klein, who studied firefighters and military decision-makers, believed that intuition often works well because humans can recognize patterns even under uncertainty. Kahneman agreed only when conditions allow learning through repetition. They eventually reached a joint conclusion. Expert intuition is valid when the environment is kind, but not when it is wicked. A kind environment is one where regular cues are linked to outcomes, such as a nurse detecting infection from subtle symptoms. A wicked environment provides misleading or delayed feedback, like an investor drawing lessons from noisy market data. In wicked environments, people form strong but false intuitions and mistake luck for skill. Kahneman warns that people are poor judges of their own expertise. Confidence feels the same whether it stems from genuine skill or illusion. Therefore, before trusting intuition, one must ask, does this environment reward consistent feedback? Can errors be quickly detected and corrected? If not, intuition should be treated as guesswork. He illustrates this with examples. Chess players and surgeons develop predictable expertise. Intelligence analysts and political pundits do not. Even within the same domain, some tasks are predictable, like diagnosing a common disease while others are not, like predicting a patient's recovery trajectory. Kahneman also discusses the danger of hindsight bias in evaluating experts. After success, people reinterpret intuition as foresight. A correct prediction seems like proof of skill, even if it was luck. The mind confuses outcome with ability, reinforcing the illusion of expertise. He emphasizes that true experts think probabilistically. They understand uncertainty, seek data, and adjust their confidence with feedback. False experts rely on stories and gut feelings. The distinguishing feature of real expertise is humility, an awareness of limits and variability. The chapter ends with a clear diagnostic test. If the environment is regular and feedback immediate, intuition deserves respect. If the environment is irregular, uncertain, or one of a kind, intuition should be distrusted and replaced with analysis. Kahneman concludes with a reminder that confidence is not a measure of accuracy. The human mind cannot easily tell when it knows something or merely believes it does. Expert intuition, when genuine, is a triumph of learning. When false, it is a trap of coherence. Wisdom lies in knowing which kind you are dealing with. Kahneman introduces one of his most valuable concepts for improving judgment and decision-making: the outside view, also known as reference class forecasting. It is a disciplined way of counteracting the planning fallacy, our systematic tendency to underestimate costs, timelines, and risks while overestimating benefits. The outside view replaces intuition and personal narrative with statistical reality drawn from comparable past cases. He begins with an example from his own experience. While developing a new curriculum for high schools in Israel, Kahneman asked his team to estimate how long the project would take. Most predicted between 1 and 2 years. Then he asked an expert on similar projects how long such initiatives typically required. The expert replied that none had been completed in less than 7 years, and many never finished at all. Despite this sobering evidence, the team ignored it, convinced their project was exceptional. It ultimately took 8 years and was never implemented. This, Kahneman notes, is the planning fallacy in action. The inside view focuses on the specific case at hand, its details, hopes, and intentions. It tells a story of uniqueness. The outside view disregards the narrative and looks instead at the outcomes of similar situations. The statistical base rate. The inside view feels more real because it engages System 1's storytelling drive, but the outside view is almost always more accurate. Kahneman explains why. System 1 constructs coherent, optimistic stories based on what we know and what we hope, while ignoring what we don't know. It embodies the Why-Sayati principle. What you see is all there is. System 2 must intervene to apply the outside view by asking, what usually happens in cases like this? A question that feels cold and impersonal but produces far better forecasts. He describes how reference class forecasting works. Identify a relevant class of similar past projects or situations. Establish the statistical distribution of outcomes in that class, average time, cost, success rate, etc. Locate your current case within that distribution. This process anchors prediction in historical data rather than imagination. It is especially valuable in planning, budgeting, policymaking, and large-scale investments, domains dominated by optimism, bias, and overconfidence. Kahneman emphasizes that adopting the outside view requires intellectual humility. People resist it because it feels like abandoning their special insight. Teams prefer the illusion that this time will be different. The inside view flatters ego and creativity. The outside view challenges them with cold statistics. He connects this bias to broader organizational behavior. In corporations and governments, the planning fallacy leads to overpromising and under-delivering. Projects exceed deadlines and budgets because planners base estimates on imagined success rather than historical precedent. Political and emotional incentives favor optimism. Realistic forecasts sound pessimistic, while caution seems like lack of vision. Kahneman also notes that even experts fall prey to this bias. Forecasting groups often rely on insider knowledge, details of the current case, while ignoring data from past outcomes. Yet he observes that the best forecasters are those who combine intuition with statistical realism. They begin with the outside view base rates, and then cautiously adjust for what is truly unique in the present case. He calls this a disciplined use of intuition. System 2 must first ground prediction in data, then allow System 1 to make small contextual adjustments. Reversing the order, starting from an intuitive story and then searching for numbers to justify it, is the source of most forecasting errors. Kahneman's lesson is clear. The outside view is not natural, but it is powerful. It forces us to confront how ordinary our cases really are and how little control we have over outcomes. It replaces stories with statistics and hope with humility. Rational forecasting demands detachment. By seeing our projects as instances of a larger pattern, we escape the illusion of uniqueness and regain perspective. The outside view, though emotionally unsatisfying, is the closest thing we have to foresight in an uncertain world. Kahneman concludes Part 3 by examining the psychological foundation of capitalism. Optimism, bias. He argues that modern economies are powered by individuals' exaggerated confidence in their own abilities and prospects. Entrepreneurs, executives, and investors routinely take on ventures that, viewed objectively, have slim chances of success. This collective overconfidence drives innovation, growth, and progress, but also waste, failure, and financial crises. He begins with a paradox. If people were perfectly rational, few would start new businesses. Statistics show that most startups fail, yet entrepreneurs typically believe their venture will be among the few that succeed. They are aware of the failure rate but think it applies to others, not themselves. This delusional optimism, as Kahneman calls it, is not a defect but a necessary fuel for economic dynamism. Without it, risk-taking would collapse. The psychological roots of this optimism lie in System 1's coherent seeking nature. People form internally consistent stories of skill, control, and destiny. They focus on their plans, resources, and intentions, the inside view, while neglecting base rates of failure, the outside view. This produces a distorted sense of probability, but one that feels energizing and meaningful. Optimism creates motivation. Realism rarely does. Kahneman notes that optimism bias pervades all levels of decision-making, from small business owners to corporate executives and political leaders. Each believes that talent, vision, or determination can overcome odds. Even when failures occur, survivors attribute their success to skill rather than luck, reinforcing the illusion that success is controllable. This survivorship bias ensures that stories of triumph drown out the statistics of failure. He also points out the self-reinforcing nature of optimism. Confidence attracts investors, employees, and partners. People prefer to follow leaders who appear certain. In this way, the illusion of control becomes a social asset, even if it rests on shaky logic. Optimism not only motivates action but also persuades others to join it. However, the same bias that fuels growth also produces systemic fragility. Overconfident decisions lead to bubbles, overinvestment, and financial crashes. Executives underestimate risks, governments overspend, and households overborrow, all driven by the belief that things will work out. The 2008 financial crisis, Kahneman suggests, was a vast demonstration of collective overconfidence in models, institutions, and markets. He distinguishes between optimistic individuals who overestimate their control over outcomes and optimistic organizations which amplify these tendencies. In corporate and political environments, groupthink intensifies the bias. Dissenting voices are dismissed as pessimistic, and warnings are ignored. The planning fallacy scales from individuals to institutions. Yet Kahneman does not dismiss optimism entirely. He views it as the engine of capitalism, an evolutionary and social force that propels humanity forward. Without it, there would be no exploration, invention, or entrepreneurship. The challenge is not to eliminate optimism, but to tame it with awareness, to combine the energy of hope with the discipline of statistics. He concludes by contrasting realism and idealism. Realists see the world as it is and avoid unnecessary risk, but they rarely change it. Optimists distort reality, underestimate obstacles, and overextend, but occasionally achieve the impossible. Civilization, Kahneman writes, owes much of its progress to the few who misjudged the odds and tried anyway. The chapter ends with a sober insight. Our greatest achievements and our greatest failures spring from the same source: the mind's stubborn belief in its own stories. Optimism may be irrational, but it is indispensable. The trick is not to silence it, but to understand when it serves us and when it blinds us.